And what's it called? Okay. Okay.
And you are live.
Hey, come on in. Look at us being an minute early. Come on. What is happening? Okay, come on in.
It won't go live until exactly 6:30. Remember, it's set for that, so you won't be live for 1 minute. I'll tell you as soon as it pops up. Sorry, Jode.
Okay, great. So don't get all
yeah.
Hello, everybody. Okay. And did you give me the ability to share?
I'm doing that right this second. Okay, now you'd have that ability. And you are live. Go ahead.
Wow! Welcome everybody to the clinical series of workshops. Welcome back. If you have been here before, welcome in. If you are new here, my name is Dr. Jody Carrington. I'm a clinical psychologist, and you have found yourself in the workshop series. Once a month, we do a talk. I do a 60-minute talk on something about mental health. Our whole goal around here is to try to make mental health and the topics around it much more accessible and something that we can just have real conversations about. So I've got a list of questions that I have seen from many of you. Thank you so much for sending those in. And so we're going to do a 60-minute talk, which I hope will answer some of these questions. And then I will jump in for the last 30 minutes, just kind of reviewing some of those. And then I can also see some of your questions on our live chat. So if there's something that you want me to clarify or expand on, let me know there. And I'm so happy to do that. One of the things that I always like to clarify before we start is that this, despite the fact that I am a psychologist, this isn't therapy. This is information about therapy and mental health and some of the things that I think we would get really confused about with our own experiences and those that we love and we care for. So just the disclaimer that this isn't therapy, and when I provide answers or comment about sort of my opinions about some of these things, it simply is that, just my opinion about some of those things, because certainly I cannot provide individual responses or advice because the context is always so important, right? But I hope this will be a place to land where you can find some good information and some resources. And you'll know in the on the site, you will see there's a link for resources. So I've made some of the notes that I'm going to talk about tonight, put them there, and then have some other links in there too that I thought might be helpful for you or somebody you love. Feel free to share it. As every time that we start one of these, I will tell you that I am in Toronto this evening, and so it looks like I'm in the dark. I know it's 6:30 at home. But wherever you're joining us from tonight, I want you to know that everything I created for you tonight happened on Treaty 7 land, which is now known as the central part of the province of Alberta. And it is home of the Blackfoot Confederacy. It is made up of the Siksika, the Kainai, the Piikani, the Tsuut'ina First Nation, the Stoney Nakoda First Nation, and the Métis Nation Region 3. Acknowledging the land on which we were allowed to, maybe we are raising our babies, creating work, playing, living, loving, doing all those things with such freedom is something that I like to talk a lot about around here. So with that, I just want to, as we always start, acknowledging just how grateful I am to be able to do that from this sacred space. Okay, tonight, personality disorders. All right. This is something that I think oftentimes when we think about clinical psychology or where people speak about psychology, there's really this sense of, what does it mean? What does personality mean? What does it mean when it gets disordered? If you take, clinical psychology 101, what they would talk a lot about is, what happens when human behavior interaction with other humans gets a little bit messed up. Oh, the other thing I might do is swear. So if you have tiny humans or anybody you don't want to hear language. I just can never really, sometimes things just come out. So I just want to give you that little bit of a disclaimer. Okay. And the other thing that I really want to sort of say before we step in is, here's the issue with anything that we're talking about in terms of a clinical diagnosis. So you will see yourself or people you love in the things we're going to talk about tonight. So I'm going to describe the 10 personality disorders as they show up in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which is easily accessible to anybody and everybody. The content of that diagnostic categorical setup. I'll tell you a little bit why I think it's dumb sometimes. And but you'll notice pieces of you or the people you love in these things. We often use the terms like, this one's narcissistic, this guy is antisocial, this person is, paranoid. There's a big difference between having traits in your personality and having a personality disorder. So just know that, many times in school, I mean, certainly all the time, I'd be like, holy fuck, I got an avoidant attachment disorder. I've got borderline personality disorder. I think today I'm bipolar. It is all of those things that I want to just really caution you around when we're talking about these things, because you will see aspects of all of these things, because personality, we are made up of so many of the similar traits, and our ways of interacting with people are not infinite. And so you'll see pieces of you in some of these things, and it doesn't mean that, oh my gosh, she's got this or they've got this. A trained mental health professional involved in making a clear diagnosis is so critical in all of these things. Okay, the purpose for tonight is to really debunk some of the myths around personality disorders and really what they mean. Okay. So that said, I want to really define a little bit about, I'm going to jump back and forth between some slides I made for you tonight, so that hopefully that will be a bit helpful when, you can follow along, because just watching me talk about this stuff is going to get kind of old, maybe fast. But okay, so what is a personality and what defines a disordered one, I think is really the question that I get a lot of questions about often. So let's just be clear. Everybody got a personality. Okay. Your personality refers to like the characteristics and behavior that make up a person's unique adjustments to life, like your major traits, your interests, your drives, your values, your self-concept, your ability. I'm somebody who is, I have an outgoing personality, and I see myself on most days as quite confident and competent. And other days, other moments even, I feel myself, I'm a bit of a failure, or I start to think about myself as, maybe a bit of a people pleaser. Any of those things that sort of identify your way of interacting with other people really becomes a sort of the piece of personality that we're talking about. And it's interesting because, when I was doing some of the research for the talk tonight, I find it, there's so many things I haven't thought about for a really long time. Like personality tends to solidify in the teenage and early adult years, which is also when the symptoms of disordered personalities are first noticed, right? So it is sort of that solid understanding of what happens to you, not what's wrong with you, what happens to you, that sort of tells the story of the world and how you should interact with people. How do people show up to you? How do you interact in the world? There's certainly a nature and a nurture component. But the thought of a disordered personality tends to fall much more in the place of what happened to you versus this idea of internally, this is something that is wrong with you. And I've often said this many times, you are not born with a personality disorder. When I talk about Kids These Days, I first talked about this concept of when I'm looking at assessing a child, for example, or an adult, anybody, I often try to think about this in my head. What are you born with and what have you acquired? And born with are things that are like, neurological, biological conditions. And so autism is a neurological condition. Clinical ADHD, we've talked about that around here before too, is a not clinical ADHD, but like legitimate ADHD is a neurological condition. Oftentimes neurological conditions are responsive to medication intervention because there's something going on in the system that sets you apart. Too much dopamine, too much serotonin, not enough dopamine, too much of this neurotransmitter. All of those things are, operating in a way that, we can sort of take a look at the brain and understand that there's something that is maybe not typical in that way. Personality disorders are a bit different, you see, because the thought is you are not born with personality disorders. You acquire them as a way of coping with the world. And I remember the first time when I learned this, when I was like, holy shit, this makes so much more sense. Because if I think about kids adapting to an environment that has either been unsafe or unclear, or when you are not sure how you show up in the world because people treat you very inconsistently, or you have somebody who is always assholery-ish and you've never had a safe place to land, no doubt you're going to shape your story about how other people are in the world and how you have to be to get your needs met. And that's really how I think our personalities develop, period. But when they become disordered, it's because the ability to have people who can walk you through hard things, keep you regulated in your emotional sense, for whatever reason, might not have been present. And the idea of having a disordered personality is, I mean, the history is longstanding in the data. And I mean, I remember speaking about this in grad school, but like tracing back to like 400 BC, when Hippocrates described, 4 personality patterns. This is the first time I think in history we can sort of see these things being separated into people. And you can think about this, way back in 400 BC, we're already noticing that some people have the capacity to just navigate relationships better than others, that their personality allows them to be much more connected in relationship, or to be fluid in working together in a community. And even as early as 400 BC, Hippocrates says, listen, I see these 4 kinds of personality patterns that seem to be, I can group people into. And he called them like ridiculous things like choleric and melancholic and phlegmatic. And basically what he came up with is like irritable, sad, optimistic, and apathetic. Irritable, dysthymic, sad, optimistic, and I'm really excited that I'm showing you these things. Anyway, apathetic, okay? So kind of flat. And he believed that these patterns were based on the 4 humors, which, I mean, again, this has all been proven to be not true, but he often talked about like black bile, yellow bile, blood, and phlegm. And so there was this idea that that's sort of what was happening in your body, and more or less of those resulted in the personality pattern that you showed up with. So very early in the understanding of personality disorders, it was very much thought to be something you were born with. And Hippocrates, wrote lots about, believed that the person's personality pattern depended on the level of, each of these humors in your body, whether you had the black bile or the yellow bile or the blood or the phlegm. And that was sort of the first thing we noticed. And then a few other big shooters all claiming that personality disorders were character flaws and couldn't be changed was really the idea, until Freud came along and was really the first guy that sort of challenged this. And he sort of took this psychoanalytic approach, and instead he was sort of believing, or started to suggest, that maybe faulty personality was innate. Not innate, it was linked to childhood experiences. So this was the first time, and he talked about it, as you may or may not know, but in a real fucked up way. Like this, this was the Oedipal complex, that like whatever. And so like he was onto something. So much of Freud's contribution to our understanding of psychology is just fascinating to me. And he was correct in so many ways. The way in which he talked about it, certainly from anyway, the perspective that he sort of broke it down with is really interesting. But I think that he was the first guy that sort of said, just a second, there might be something that shapes our personality based on our childhood experiences. And then we sort of regressed in that place, because in the 1950s, those with, sort of what we know as personality disorders now were again not viewed as being mentally ill, but rather it was a view that like there was a character flaw and a purposeful irrational behavior was happening. So you can see then the stigma that still comes around people who are personality disordered when we say things like, she's got the borderline, or this person is, narcissistic personality disorder. It's very hard to treat. All of those things. It's so ingrained that you can't shift it. That certainly comes from our understanding at one point that the thought was you can't. The first DSM, so Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, was published in 1952. And for psychologists and psychiatrists, this is the manual of all of the mental disorders. And there's so much conversation about how fucked up that is, because you just put people in categories, many of which we never fit. Specifically, it's been revised many times because, as you know, as opposed to a medical condition or a physical condition, even though those are quite there's wide spectrums as well, but it's very difficult for many mental or emotional conditions to be able to sort of identify specifically this is what it is. The DSM, conversely, is very helpful in being able to sort of identify what a group of symptoms tend to look like in a person, and then you can study and figure out how best to treat, support, understand, predict behavior, understand where it came from, which always then informs us in terms of the world of treatment. So many of us, me included, have a love-hate relationship with the DSM, and I struggle so much, particularly in the world of personality disorders, because there's been an attempt to sort of shove them into 3 different clusters to help us make sense of, how this happens to people. Because when you have experienced a personality disorder, I'll tell you what, the biggest issue is life is fucking difficult. Because there is a disordered way, or there is a way of operating in the world that makes it very difficult sometimes to show up in relationship. So in the first DSM, it was first published in 1952. It was the first time we've ever seen the DSM. It officially recognized the category of personality disorders, defined them as this: patterns of behavior, resistant to change, but not connected to a lot of anxiety or personal distress on the part of the patient. So of course, a bit different than what we see it today. But I love this initial diagnosis, or this initial description, in some ways, because here's the difference between a mood disorder and a personality disorder. And these terms really make a lot of sense to me. Egosyntonic and ego dystonic. If I'm trying to make a diagnosis between, is this something that you feel is a part of you? It's egosyntonic. And it's inside of you. You feel like it's a part of you, and it doesn't really bother you. It's just who you are. Personality disorders tend to be egosyntonic. Ego dystonic means it's outside of me. I don't want the anxiety, the depression, all of those kind of things. It feels yucky. It is an experience that I know is not what I want or who I am. Okay. And the interesting thing about, personality disorders, which I think sometimes makes sense to me, is that they become a part of who we are based on how we've understood the world to be. So sometimes there isn't a lot of insight into how my way of showing up in the world seems justified based on the stories that I've told based on my experiences of how the world should work. So I need to show up and get my needs met by losing my mind, or telling you I love you and then I hate you, or, the world feels really chaotic because it has been chaotic for a particular person. Okay. Now, I think, there's also been a lot of conversation around the cause of personality disorders. And again, I think that's the question, right? Are you born with them? I would argue completely you're not. It's believed that they may be triggered by genetic and environmental influences, but most prominently, your experience in childhood and the trauma that may or may not have existed in that way. And what I think is, particularly with some of them, so we're going to talk about specifically, some, what these disorders look like. But some important considerations is that these experiences should cause significant distress and impairment in at least 2 of the following areas. Okay. We can all have quirky personalities. We can all, want to be organized people, or controlling people, or have things in order, or be really laid back and, not give a shit about other people. Some people are extroverts. Some people are introverted in their way of operating. All of those things are categories and, of things that we can sort of experience. But when it becomes in this state of disorder, okay, which is, relatively speaking, a small subset of the population. Disorders mean that there'll be 2 things, at least 2 of these things are going to cause significant distress and impairment in, number 1, the way you perceive or interpret yourself and other people. The way you see yourself or other people, there's significant distress in that way. Like generally, how you show up becomes really unclear. Why does everybody feel like this about me? Why do I? And why is the whole world like this all the time? The way you act when dealing with other people, this really is, I think, the interaction with, how you navigate relationship is really what it comes down to. The appropriateness of emotional responses, how you can manage your own emotion. And if you've been around here long, my favorite concept to explore in every subset of mental health issues is the concept of emotional regulation. Can you stay calm in times of distress? Can you repair a relationship? Can you figure out how to get through conflict that is part of relationship? One of the hallmarks of a personality disorder is your appropriateness of emotional responses is a bit skewed or fucked up. Okay. For me, when you experience trauma, when you haven't had corrective experiences or any experiences to suggest to you how you walk through big emotion, or you've had damaging experiences that kind of fuck up that story, it then becomes difficult to remain emotionally regulated in relationship. And so you learn really dysfunctional patterns in an attempt to get those needs met or to keep your body calm. You either avoid, or you're super paranoid, or you try to connect and shut off relationships on and on to sort of test people to see if they're going to be there, because you don't really have that internal sense that they're going to be. And you could imagine that sense of going back and forth in relationship would make it really difficult to sort of stay in that place. And sort of connected to this is also how well you control your impulses. And so there's a lot of conversation around personality disorders and impulse control. Okay. So I think, again, suffice it to say, it's this idea that patterns of behavior that cause significant distress. And I think one of the questions that came up a lot, when that were sent in, I think is such a good question. Here's where we get messed up a lot: mood disorders and personality disorders. Okay. Mood disorders can be acquired, but there typically tends to be a genetic component to them. Now, mood disorders are things like anxiety, depression, and this thing called bipolar disorder. Mood disorders talk about the patterns in feelings, while personality disorders focus on how people relate to others. Okay, so that's the number one difference. Now, what often gets fucked up is bipolar disorder and borderline personality disorder. Two very different things. One is a mood disorder, one is a personality disorder. And a bipolar disorder is a undulation of moods that tend to go high and low. There's all kinds of conversations about that. Bipolar is more often than not, will have a genetic component to it. There is a mood issue that is often related to neurotransmitters, versus a borderline personality disorder. They have the same BPD, which messes people up all the time. Borderline is also an undulating sense of emotion, but it's also it's much more about how people relate to others. Okay, so the difference again between a mood disorder and a personality disorder: mood disorder is about the pattern of feelings, what's happening with the emotional responses to things, and personality disorder is often about how people relate to others. Okay, that's the way you show up in the world in relationship to others. Okay, it still can fuck you up, and you could still, can you have a mood disorder and a personality disorder? Yes, you can, but you can imagine that if the way I show up in the world is disordered, if the way I show up in the world, I don't trust people, I have a pattern of thinking that is maladaptive, along with that will come anxiety, depression. I may not, I don't understand why people keep treating me like this. I feel so sad that people don't understand me. I feel so anxious to be out with other people because I don't fucking get how people work. Or more importantly, they don't get how I work. So it's often a chicken and egg question, but in my most clear moments, a personality disorder is the way of understanding how people in the world operate with each other, which then can understandably induce mood-related disorders sometimes. There may also be genetic components of that, but let's just go with this for now. And mood disorders are much more about what's happening in the emotions and the feelings that are in one's body. Okay. And of course, that affects the way you interact with people, but the origin is very different. Okay. How are we doing, Marty? Is there any questions coming up?
Yeah, this is one emotional regulation also emotional.
So when you are emotionally dysregulated, can you learn at one point, if you've had really shitty trauma experiences or you're disordered as a personality, your emotional dysregulation happens because of the way that you were treated in childhood, can you figure that out? Can you adapt to that and navigate that in adulthood? Yes! That's why I do what I do every single day. If it was predetermined in childhood that if you had a shitty experience, you're fucked forever, what's the point? Now, here's the issue. We tend to get into patterns with people who have disordered ways of thinking or operating in the world. And in order to break that pattern, we often sometimes need a corrective experience or somebody who understands why they show up, how they need to get the story in their head about getting their needs met often takes a shift in that approach, okay? Empathy, usually, which is really hard to do after, people have been really shitty to you again and again and again. It doesn't matter what you try, it's fucking exhausting. So what I want to talk about, first of all, is for the next probably 5 minutes is just to clarify a little bit around the diagnoses and the diagnostic types and descriptions. Okay, so I'm gonna just share this with you so that you can take a look at this instead of me. There we go. Okay, so there you are. So having a personality disorder affects the way someone sort of interacts with people, and it harms the way that people sort of interact with others. And oftentimes it is very, very egosyntonic. You don't really sort of see that it's a bit of a problem, typically speaking. And the issue is there's 3 clusters. So if I were to think about this from a diagnostic perspective, there is 3 clusters. If I'm thinking about what's happening with a human being who I know is really struggling with interacting with people they love, or they interact with, most often, I don't think about, the DSM has sort of categorized 10 personality disorders. So now, after many iterations of the DSM, 5 or more to be exact, we've come up with 10 kinds of descriptions of personality disorders that kind of make it difficult to interact with others in the world. Okay, the big shooters at the DSM have come up with 3 clusters: cluster A, B, and C. And oftentimes I think about these clusters like, this is a bit, when I was studying to sort of remember what they were, I would categorize this in the most respectful way of weird, wild, and worried. And so cluster A is sort of identified, grouped together to represent 3 kinds of personality disorders that have odd thinking and eccentric behavior as kind of their hallmarks. Okay, and then there is cluster B, that is kind of the wild ones. Dramatic and erratic behavior is really what we see in those kind of responses to the world. And then cluster C is kind of the worried group, the severe anxiety and fear about people and organization in the world. And I think that, what I find really interesting when we start to talk about, some of these experiences is really like, what is happening when we think about, each of them. So you'll see, let's go over this real quick. So cluster A, sorry, I went down to one, so I want you just to see this bit better. Cluster A is 3 things. Paranoid, you may have heard of some of these, but I'll clarify them in each a little bit. Paranoid personality disorder, a schizoid personality disorder, or schizotypal. Sometimes people say schizoid, sometimes people say schizotypal. I think it's weird, but it's schizoid in my world, and schizotypal. Now, the problem with this, and I remember getting so many things confused even in my training, neither of those have anything to do with schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is a neurological condition that often has some things related closely to those 2 things, but that very different than the personality disorder. Okay, so we'll dive into those in 1 second. Cluster B sees 4 personality disorders. Antisocial. This is mostly connected with like sociopathic behavior. This is a kind of the one that You cannot diagnose before the age of 18. All the other ones you can, which is really a huge myth in the world of our in psychology and social work. You should never diagnose a personality disorder early because kids' personalities are still developing. I have many opinions about that. But I think the only personality disorder that is clearly stated within the DSM that says you cannot diagnose before the age of 18 is antisocial personality disorder, and for many good reason. I'll talk about that a little more in a minute, but borderline personality disorder, which is probably the most popular one, it's the one where there's the most research on it. People get the most concerned about it. It's I think also the most popular, if you will. Then there's a couple of others in that dramatic or that sort of wild category that are histrionic and narcissistic. We use the term narcissistic. This is this kid is so narcissistic, or this person is a lot. But I want to really clarify, what a narcissistic personality disorder is and why it develops. And then cluster C is the severe anxiety or the worried group. So there's 3 that fall into this cluster: avoidant, dependent, and obsessive compulsive personality disorder. Okay. Even on this slide, I forgot the word personality. Obsessive compulsive disorder is very different than obsessive compulsive personality disorder. Okay. So I've just sort of broken it down a little bit further here to be able to, unpack it a little bit. You will see that I had an extra space that I called sample headline in the bottom of the 2, cluster A and cluster C. I just didn't have enough room, and I didn't edit any text there. So just ignore those 2 bottom little things. So let's just dive in a little bit to cluster A. So paranoid, schizoid, and schizotypal personality disorders are really that kind of weird kind of group. Paranoid, as you can understand, is distrusting, suspicious. You are always, this kind of person has really developed the way of operating in the world that you can't trust anybody. And it's sort of to the point sometimes where it gets so invasive that you just don't trust anybody. In fact, you're very suspicious, always thinking somebody is cheating, having an affair, getting after you. You can't trust the world. You very much inherently have this sense that you can't trust the world and somebody is going to do you wrong. You can imagine how that can be really dysfunctional in relationship. If this is, when somebody's regulated and they feel okay and you develop a relationship, and they tend to then, when they get dysregulated, sometimes this becomes the narrative that is really true. Watch yourself. You cannot trust anybody. Individuals with this personality disorder clinically tend to be very private. They hold grudges. It's very difficult to treat paranoid personality disorders in a group. Oftentimes, for example, when you get over cluster B, one of the best interventions is group therapy. But paranoid personality disorders tend to be the kind that you want to really work on some of those assumptions about how the world works one-on-one. Now, schizoid and schizotypal, these are sort of, I don't know my favorite, but schizoid is sort of social detachment and restricted emotional expression. Okay, so I often think about the flatness of this. There's a preference to be alone. There's no worry that they're missing out. We'll notice when we jump over to avoidant personality disorder that I think I'm going to fuck up in my relationship, so I avoid people. A schizoid, somebody who has a schizoid personality disorder just doesn't fucking like people. And they're like, I'm out. And I think there's no desire for close relationships. And so people say, how does this sort of interact with, somebody on the autistic spectrum? There's many criteria that separate, a schizoid or a schizoid personality disorder and somebody on the spectrum. But it really is that idea that I just want to be based on my knowledge of how humans interact with the world. I'm just saying, fuck it. Okay. Schizotypal, on the other hand, is more of the odd one. There's some strangeness to this, the way that this person shows up in relationships, thoughts, behaviors, superstitions. There's oftentimes some magical thinking, really bordering on this idea of psychosis, the delusional thinking. It's tricky to sort of separate the two from schizophrenia, but when you see somebody who experiences a full-blown experience with schizophrenia, it's remarkably different. So then, of course, those 3 things you can imagine. get us into places that because of the world, how the world has interacted with you, you develop these patterns of responding to the people around you. Okay, so that's really the otter eccentric one. If I think about cluster B, then this is the one where people talk a lot about. So let's spend a little bit more time here. This is the, again, the dramatic, the wild personality disorders, 4 of them here. And antisocial is the disregard for and violation of the rights of others. I could give a fuck. Now, lots of conversations about this, and I've had multiple debates over whether people are born this way. And to the core of me, I cannot believe that is true. There is not a human being with an antisocial personality disorder, somebody who we would describe as sociopathic, somebody who early in childhood, got a diagnosis of conduct disorder. That is often what you see in kids before we move into an antisocial personality disorder, that have not had a massive history of trauma. That there is just an internal understanding of the world, that it is not safe, it cannot be trusted, people will fuck you up. They have blown apart your understanding of safety in relationship. It does not condone, support, make sense of their behavior, but it really makes sense to me about why. So there's we see a lack of empathy, compassion, very deceitful, breaks rules and laws, could give a shit, but also charming on the surface, right? Because in order to get those needs met, I understand how to be manipulative, if you will, really connection seeking with no expectation that you're going to follow through anyway. Okay, so it doesn't matter. So I become very antisocial in that way. This is probably, by the data, one of the hardest to treat, because it's very difficult to change that internal sense of how the world works when it gets to that degree of visceral understanding of people. So there's sometimes a lot of impulsive or aggressive actions that happen here, and criminal behaviors quite frequently, something that you'll see. And again, it's the only one that cannot be diagnosed until adulthood, of all of these that you see in front of you. Now, borderline personality disorder. This is the one that people talk about to me all the time. Some of the ones that I would say, there's a massive caveat in the world of psychology. Be careful when you have a borderline patient, somebody with borderline personality disorder, because it's very difficult to navigate relationship, because their number one experience in the world is that relationships are unstable, and they don't feel as though they're worthy in the world of developing a relationship, always concerned that you're going to leave. There's lots of abandonment, often a history of abuse, and often of a sexual nature that really has destroyed the understanding of safety in a relationship. Okay, so it's often marked by instability, clinginess, poor identity, intense love-hate, pull away. I'm going to test to see if you're still going to be there. It becomes very difficult to kind of navigate that intensity. Suicidal ideation and attempts are frequent, because you can imagine living in a body that is just so unsure about how the world works, that it feels like sometimes it's not even safe to be in your own body. There's an impulsivity here that becomes really frequent. And although I think it's much more difficult, there is this sense that it's 3 times more popular, 3 times more diagnosed, 3 times more often in women. And it is probably the personality disorder where you see a lot of self-harm, suicide. Splitting is also common in their approach to people. You're either my best friend or I hate you. There's very little gray, which is really marked by a very early sense of thinking. When kids are really little, it's all or nothing, it's black or white. And oftentimes, because of experiences, that developmental process was messed up early. And so still in an adult body, we're still very much thinking in black or white. And it gets very scary to stay in that space, because it is so unclear about how the world is going to respond to you, that it becomes very difficult to show up in it. One of the most popular treatments that I can just talk about specifically, that was developed specifically for people with borderline personality disorder, is dialectical behavior therapy by Marsha Linehan. And I put one of the books that I suggested in there. She most recently wrote a memoir about her experience, and is one of the the world's most trusted resource on, how you navigate people who just have had such a difficult experience with the world. And she's brilliant, and giving her own story is remarkable. She spent a number of years in a psychiatric inpatient unit, and I'm just halfway through her memoir right now, and it's so telling about, what corrective experiences and insight can do as you work through your traumas and understanding of the world, and how the repair can happen. But it often is, depending on the degree of trauma or the understanding of how the world works, sometimes it becomes difficult to do that. Group therapy is often the go-to there, because there is that test of how can you trust a relationship that stay emotionally regulated in it. Okay, so histrionic, I think that, when I think about histrionic and narcissistic, there's a hollowness. When I think about people who sort of see the world from this place. Histrionic is often talked about as attention seeking, I would say, connection seeking, but there's a lot of drama. Sometimes there's overly sexual or provocative ways of showing up in the world, tend to be more diagnostically found in women. This idea that I need to get my needs met in a very big, overarching way is sort of the definition of a histrionic personality disorder. And then narcissistic personality disorder is really the grandiosity, the need for admiration. There tends to be a lack of empathy there, and a sense of superiority. There's some exploitation of others, but a very fragile self-esteem at the same time. And so what often people misunderstand about narcissistic personality disorder is that it hasn't been safe in the world to appear as anything but I'm the best. But it doesn't mean that's what it looks like underneath. It's very difficult sometimes, I think, the superiority, the grandiosity that comes along with a personality disorder that tends to be narcissistic makes it very difficult to break through, to have a vulnerable connection with, because it hasn't been safe for somebody with a narcissistic personality disorder to sort of get through those things. Now, when you're dealing with a narcissist, sometimes we use these labels sort of interchangeably. But I think the thing I often caution about is not, how they show up, but why. Why do they believe that the world is that way? Why, what is the story behind those things, which really then is often indicative of where treatment or where the patterns need to sort of be rewritten a little bit. And cluster C is, of course, the worried type of ones. And this is, you've got avoidant, dependent, obsessive compulsive personality disorder. So those three are in there. So let's talk about this real quick, because I think avoidant is like intense fear of rejection. So there's often partner conflict. There's often threats of suicide. There is just such an intense fear of rejection. So they avoid. They want to be in relationship, but they're so scared of it. So they tend to avoid. They're worried about how they're going to show up. So they socially inhibit feelings of inadequacy, hypersensitivity to negative evaluation. So it's just easier if you pull away, as opposed to a schizoid personality disorder, which is really like, I don't even give a fuck. I don't want to be around people because I don't get them. These ones really want these ones. People who have experienced this way of operating really want to be there, but just feel like they can't. As opposed to then dependent personality disorder, which is really this idea that it's very poor self-confidence and you need someone else. You're not lazy in that I need everybody else to do this for me. I just can't navigate in this world without you. Without somebody, needs to be taken care of. We often see this, in a very, I'm going to save your, sort of keep you healthy and safe kind of thing. But then you sort of just feel helpless in this relationship and you cling to one person. There's a lot of regression that sometimes happens. So regressive behavior, I just don't know what to do. Can you just save me? Changes in voice and an ability to just sort of give it back because the world, you sort of learned in the world that you can't be competent to do that yourself. And then when you get into a dynamic with somebody who just says, yes, I'll do it, it can also become then very exhausting when at one point, you're like, come on, you can do this. And they're like, no, I can't. So you can see how it ramps it up. OCPD is So you think about obsessive compulsive disorder, it is the ability, is the inability, right? It is a destructive pattern of having the world exactly in an order that you have to do certain things to alleviate the anxiety or the distress that you feel in your body to be able to navigate the world. OCPD is much more about perfectionism, being orderly, preoccupied with detail, so much to the point that you get stuck, stiff, formal. It's very egocentric. So they like it. Whereas somebody with OCD, as a clinical disorder, you are born with components of OCD. You don't want to be this way. You can see how dysfunctional it is. You know that coming back and checking 67 times is fucking dumb and it's wrecking everything, but you just can't operate without it. OCPD is very clear that when it's a personality disorder, it's syntonic. You understand? It needs to be this way because this is how the fucking world works. And there's no understanding about why it doesn't be that way. Okay. Lists, very moral and ethical, hoarding behavior, rigid, stubborn, all of those things sort of tend to be in that place of like, my understanding of the world is that it works this way. So this is how I have to show up in it. Okay. Versus a need to alleviate anxiety, which is what we see more in the OCD realm. Okay. So what I think is true is that, let me just pop out of this for a little bit. What I think is true about this experience is, when we sort of get back to the understanding of, personality disorders and sort of how they show up in the world, there's a number of them. And my point here is that one of the things that I think, people struggle with a lot is, why do people develop personality disorders? And it simply comes back to this thing for me, this understanding for me that if the world doesn't feel like a safe place, for whatever reason, the story in your head is that it isn't, it becomes very difficult to navigate. And those 10 styles tend to be the ones that end up making relationships tricky and interacting with the world tricky. And they became so tricky that we put them in a big diagnostic manual that would say, when you get to this stage of trickiness, it's going to really affect the way that you show up in the world. Okay. Now, if I were to think about treatment considerations, as I put in your notes, I didn't go into a big conversation around treatment, but there is a lot of research around this that, we certainly can find, but primarily, as I said to you, dialectical behavior therapy and the data around EMDR, eye movement desensitization therapy, has proven extremely effective to take a look at the feelings and the responses in the body to what that feels like in the world and how we show up in it. Okay. I think that's, those are the two. The other thing, medications are often considered to treat secondary or additional symptoms like mood disorders or psychoses, but few, if any, medications work specifically for personality disorders as a condition, primarily because these disorders are acquired and not 100% neurological, right? So I think then, that really is sort of indicative of how they're developed and why, how best we interact and treat. I did include in your handout tips for staying connected. And this is if you are somebody who has been diagnosed with a personality disorder, or if you love somebody who has, all of these tips sort of apply. So I'm going to just jump back into the share screen so we can go through them real quick together. Okay. So what you'll see is when we talk about when a body is in a state of emotional dysregulation, all of the personality disorders come to this place where it's like the world doesn't make sense and the people in it don't seem to respond to me the way that I need them to be. And one of the things I talk about so much in this world of, coming up with strategies or treatment suggestions is we often forget to understand in an emotionally dysregulated body, you are going to struggle with how the world works, period, whether you have a personality disorder or not. And it's so funny because, not so funny, but I think one of the issues that we overlook all the time is just the basics, right? And I mean, I talk about this all the time when people are really struggling. One of my number one questions to anybody when I do a mental health assessment is, how was your sleep? And I was talking about this today when I spoke to teachers here in Ontario today, and I was saying, tell me, what does it look like when a toddler misses a nap? Right? They're assholery-ish, right? So are you. So if you have difficulty regulating emotion or understanding how the world works, or it's difficult to navigate it, your physical health is the most controllable component of any condition. Okay, so when I think about things like, particularly important when personality disorders and the emotional dysregulation that often comes along with them are at play. So sleep is the number one consideration, as is diet and exercise, and making sure we're covering the basics is always the best place to start. Okay, so if this is you that is struggling, are we looking after you to be able to get to the best parts of you? If this is, you see somebody in a dip in your world, let's get back to the basics. Are we drinking? Are we eating? Are we sleeping? Sometimes being able to slow the body down enough with medication to get sleep is sometimes an intervention that, speaking to your physician about becomes really important, because sometimes given a trauma-filled body or a body that just doesn't believe the world is safe, it makes it very difficult to sleep. So how do we work together to be able to navigate a place where we can get the body back in a place where it can start to heal, or it can start to make sense of the world a little bit easier? Really usually comes back to the sense of physical health. Okay. The other thing that I think is really important, because of the egosyntonic nature of personality disorders, which means it is they understand why they see the world this way, right? And it makes sense. This is why the world is these ways. It's often helpful to have someone to talk to. And I mean, a trained professional, a therapist, a trusted professional who can provide feedback and sort of allow practice to stay regulated and connected in relationships as you navigate the things that aren't working. There's needs to be a degree of openness to that, which sometimes makes it a bit tricky. This is why we talk about an antisocial personality disorder. Sometimes it's hardest to sort of get through there because there's been so much evidence to suggest that's not true. You've spent some time in prison, you've, been wronged by so many people in the world. There's no trust to be able that, your attempts to make that right are not contrived in some way. But I think what is so critically important, so Marsha Linehan's sort of the premise of dialectical behavior therapy is really this idea of, can we trust in relationships? Can you provide a correct experience within the boundaries of a relationship again and again and again? And how do we set those boundaries in a way that we get to practice with understanding what a boundary means? And she scripted it out so beautifully that you can meet the needs in this attachment way of operating. I can regulate your emotion and send you back out in the world. I can regulate your emotion and send you back out in the world, very much like what we do when we're trying to develop emotional regulation in children. And it's the same concept in so many ways of being able to, there's going to be the panic, we got it, go out in the world kind of a conversation. 3, to that point, keeping a mood diary is something that, people talk about often in a behavioral sense of operating. And sometimes I struggle really with behavioral prescriptions that don't happen in the context of a systemic understanding. But I think what is helpful sometimes is when you're trying to understand why you struggle in relationship to other people, or why somebody you love struggles, just noting patterns or cues that tend to make it more difficult for you or someone you love to regulate emotion is often helpful in understanding how to anticipate and support yourself or those you love through the ups and downs. Is it typically, at big holidays? Do I get overwhelmed and insecure when, certain people are in the room, or when we went too long without talking? Or what does it take to sort of help that mood regulate and then start to talk about those patterns and get some insight around them? I notice when, or I'm aware now in my own body, son of a bitch, this happens when I feel like this. Okay. So sometimes those, just that data is helpful in sort of understanding. The other thing I put on the sheet was really the use of medication, monitoring medication use. Although there's no specific treatment from a specific medication, this medication is for whatever, narcissistic personality disorder. It can be critical in managing secondary anxiety or depression or sleep that can help with mood stability and an ability to stay emotionally regulated in those moments. And so oftentimes we see an impulsive nature in the way that medication is used. And so I need it now, I don't need it then. And so really monitoring that and helping your body to stay as regulated as you possibly can is really critically important, I think, in having somebody help you do that, because this egosyntonic place of operating sometimes makes it difficult not to stay in the moment. The other thing that, I talk a lot about, and we have some questions that we're going to go through right a bit, in a bit about, the boundaries when people, really distrust the way that the world operates, or require other people to either confirm or deny that the world is a safe place. Being in a relationship with somebody who truly is on the clinical end of a disordered personality, or an emotionally dysregulated state again and again and again and again, means that the understanding of boundaries and limits and setting expectations so that you're okay in this process. I put in our notes, be kind and don't tolerate bullshit, in that order. It is often the necessity to sort of collect and then direct, as Dan Siegel talks about, getting the lid back on, keeping things calm, and then going back out on the other side. And it feels exhausting and overwhelming, as it often does with kids who have had significant trauma, because just when you think you've sort of regulated the emotion, just when you have experienced emotional regulation, here it comes again, right? Your body keeps the score, and it believes so much viscerally that the world may or may not be a safe place. And so it is that constant state of, how do we develop that story, that dance, that we can start to decrease the intensity and frequency of those mistrusting disconnections in the world. And the other thing that I think is really helpful, is making a plan during the calm or the good times that can help you both navigate when emotions get a little higher. Right? So the next time you wonder if I'm having an affair, how are we going to handle this? The next time when, you start to say things to me like, I'm going to kill myself, right? Let's make a plan about what we're going to do so we can walk through that together. And in the moment, that's often where we get the most distressed. When your lid is lit, particularly if I care for somebody, I love somebody desperately, who, when they're emotionally regulated, are the most incredible human on the planet. And when they're emotionally dysregulated, that tends to dysregulate me too. We both lose access to the best parts of ourselves. So is there a time, often over a cup of tea or coffee or whatever, that we can sort of have a conversation and make a plan about what I need and what you might need in those moments? It doesn't mean I'm not going to come back to you. It doesn't mean all of these things. We have to figure this out, because I want access to the best parts of you, and you want access to the best parts of you. So sometimes that helps. You have to revisit that often, but it is that sense of like, okay, how do we rewrite this dance given who you are and who we are? Clarifying there, number 7 in your handout, I just said, try always to acknowledge emotions first. And after that, less is more. Getting back to a clear plan or expectations can be helpful to not get caught up in the cycle of big emotions. But do you love me? Do you really love? Okay, let's talk about our plan here, right? Our job when things feel out of control is to drop those shoulders and take a deep breath, get back in our bodies. That's what we're going to do. I don't know. Come on back, right? This state of emotional regulation in doing therapy or in helping somebody through this process is so critically important, which is really why, in number 9, I'll just jump there real quick. As a loved one, a caregiver, a therapist, you are the most important hearts to consider, because remaining regulated so you can view the bids for connection or disconnection clearly can be the most helpful. And it really is that ability to either have the support for you or understand that, okay, I can go back in and do this again and, get back to the best parts of myself or the person that I love. The last thing I'll talk about is not ignoring threats of suicide or self-harm. And so sometimes I often hear people say they're manipulative or attention seeking, and they're just threatening to kill themselves because they always do this and they always want to get my attention in this way. Oh my goodness. I understand to the core of me how difficult this can be, and how you just there's often rhetoric that says just ignore it, right? I will tell you from the bottom of my soul, all behavior has meaning. And when we resort to, and many people have conversations about this because it tends to garner connection. And it can be helpful to make a plan for intervention or support when these big feelings start to take over. Again, it's that place of, it scares me when you say these things, or I get scared to the point of, I feel in my body that I just would be better off not here. You'd be better off without me. Being able to have those conversations, that when your brain feels like that's your only option, here's what we're going to do. Okay. So oftentimes we tend to want to have these conversations in the moment, which I understand because they're so disconcerting. And they're like, what the fuck do you mean you're going to, what, don't, oh my, okay. So if this is a repeated pattern, it's something that then, okay, what is our plan when, and how can we stick to it to the best of our abilities? Okay. So I hope some of these things are helpful. I appreciate all the time that in these 1 hour workshops, it feels like there's a million things we didn't get to. The only purpose for me today was really to identify the fact that oftentimes people who experience disordered personalities tend to be in a place where the world just didn't make sense to them or for them, that their body is made up in a way, or their experiences more so has been putting them into this place where people can't be trusted. And so then they've responded in the world in a very specific way that we then tend to categorize in 10 of these ways, identified in 3 clusters. And, the specific treatment considerations are all, oriented towards relationship, regulating emotion, getting back in the sense of, working how you figure out how you trust in the world. And I think there's a couple of things that I've read that I think might be helpful. Building a Life Worth Living is Marsha Linehan's book that just came out in 2021, a really great read about her personal struggle. And then I oftentimes feel like the insight around what happens when people have to split, or like split relationships. There's a book that, I've read or recommended a number of times to people navigating. It's by Eddie and Kruger, and it's called Splitting, Protecting Yourself when you're divorcing or separating with somebody who is really struggling with a personality disorder. How do you stay regulated in this process? So I've just put the link in there. And then one of the most common ones, I think it's on its 3rd edition now, is called I Hate You, Don't Leave Me. And it's understanding borderline personality disorder. And they've done, Kreischman and Strauss have done such a beautiful job of depicting just how much of a struggle it is to try to figure out the world when it's been so unclear to you. So I love those 3 things. I hope they might be helpful places for you to land. And I think, now what I would love to talk about, I think this is the end of our presentation, as it were. And I'm going to just jump into some of those questions. I hope some of those things are helpful. Take a look at that resource sheet, and certainly pass it on to anybody who you think might help to use it. Okay, so if you can refresh your page, the resources will now come up. Apparently they didn't load properly, and so now they're up and they're there. So if you just refresh your page, they will be there, and they will also be available if you're watching this after in your on this platform. Yeah. Okay, Marty, anything come up in the question stuff there? Do you want to give me a few?
We see students with diagnosis of oppositional defiance disorder.
Yeah. Okay. So oppositional defiant disorder is not a personality disorder. Oppositional defiant disorder is something you are not born with. Okay. Very similar to this concept it is a group of symptoms that would indicate that the ability to stay emotionally regulated has been challenged in some way, either from a neurological condition that may be present, but often from a combination of either, their own way of seeing the world, but also the ability to sort of regulate emotion. There's been a struggle in learning that, right? And I often talk about, Ram Dass's quote about we're all just here walking each other home. For whatever reason, some kids need more walkers than others. And for whatever reason, sometimes certain kids haven't had the most regulated walkers, often through no fault of their own. And so they come back into our classrooms where the expectation is to be regulated, use their words, stay online, not online, keep their brain online. When they can't, they flip all the time, get emotionally dysregulated all the time. And so it looks like oppositional defiant disorder, which means I'm not going to agree. I'm not going to follow directions. Fuck you. I don't like you. All of those things. Which means I'm just going to do this quick. The response always in my world to oppositional defiant disorder is I got to understand the story. Not as what's wrong with you, but what happened to you. And mostly, what do you need to keep you regulated? What is our plan to be able to bring you back again and again and again? Some of those things will be one of the best interventions on the planet, the most teachable, corrective experiences are having big people in the world who can walk you through big emotion. Full stop. Particularly if you have a diagnosis of ODD. What else?
How do you deal with that with both A and B that do not see both parents?
Okay. Now, there's a couple of questions in here that talk about what do you do when people don't see that they have a problem? This is the nature of a personality disorder, as it is defined in the DSM. It is egosyntonic, which means I don't necessarily see this as a problem. The way that the world has responded to me is how I have created my way of responding in this world. So there is oftentimes people that don't, they're like, no, right? Like that's the nature of that way. And it's understandable given their experiences. It's understandable sometimes given the way that their body has shown up in the world or how they've been treated. Part of the issue around insight comes back to when we are having these conversations, who's having these conversations, and how it's done. Okay. When people are in a state of emotional dysregulation, when their lid is flipped. And so if you haven't done this before with me, do it real quick. Put your thumb on the inside of your hand, wrap your fingers around your thumb. That's a hand model of the brain. Okay. And if you flip your fingers up, your limbic system lives in here. Fight, flight, or freeze. Okay. What separates humans from most other mammals is the prefrontal cortex that wraps around the limbic system. Everything you've ever learned in your life lives in there, including how you interact with people, what it looks like to have somebody give you empathy, to kindness, emotional, people walking you through hard things, paying attention to you, connecting to you in times of distress. All of those things happen up here. If that's been fucked up in some way, if you don't have an ability to regulate emotion in times of distress because of whatever, abuse, neglect, trauma, unfortunate experiences, legacy burdens, any of those kind of things, right? You tend to be a little bit, keeping that lid on has been a struggle because there isn't the neural pathways that have allowed it to stay on in times of distress. And so you just fucking lose your mind a little bit more often. And when I think about when people who struggle with personality disorders, as you were, get into a state where that is threatened, relationship is threatened, they don't understand the concept, or there's a skewed understanding of relationships, they flip. Anybody who is flipped becomes very difficult to reason with, becomes very difficult to teach. In fact, it's impossible. And oftentimes when people are in their most highest state of distress is when we want to teach and want to point it out and want to explain things and what the fuck is wrong with you and what are we doing? Okay. That is the number one mistake. The first order of business always is to get these lids back on, is to have a plan when, not if, this is going to happen again. Because if your way of responding to the world, your expectation is, I love you, I hate you, or this is ridiculous, I have to tell you that I'm an absolutely perfect human being before this ever happened. Okay. Come on back. Does that make sense? Does that make sense? What Marty's saying yes, which she basically has no other choice to say anything about right now. But it is this idea that when you're emotionally dysregulated, bringing it back down is the thing. Okay. I'm going to just jump to a question here. That I had. So my 42-year-old daughter is a narcissistic nightmare to be around. Okay. So I'm going to guess that this means, very self-focused. My family, even her sister, refused to have much to do with her as she has used and abused all of us. My question is how to best help her two sons deal with this. She's a single mom and I have helped her raise them. They are 19 and 20 and the 19-year-old has struggles and there's a dependence from the child. Her eldest son has become unmotivated. So it becomes really difficult when we think about, of course, knowing the context of this specific case, when we get into intergenerational work around navigating relationships. It's so interesting when I think about the jump between grandparent to grandchild. And oftentimes what becomes so difficult is the relationship between the primary caregiver and the child, not just the grandchild, but the child. Oftentimes I would say the work, which becomes really difficult, happens mostly between the big people, not the little people. And it becomes so hard because the big people start to observe the ability of grandparents to then be kind and be connected. We are very different typically with our grandkids than we are with our own children. And so that dynamic tends to be able to set up for a lot of hurt and disconnect, because it is sort of like the concept is really like my children matter more to me than I do to you, and how do we navigate those things? So I know the question is really about how do we help the children. How you help the children to the best of your capacity is to do whatever you can to repair, to understand, to rebuild relationship with your child, and then to be able to assist in the process. Now, if that's not possible, I understand that the safety of the grandchildren matter much more, but so much of our ability to show children how to handle situations is how we deal with them, how we show them how it's done, how we work to do our very best to repair relationship, to get big people regulated first. How do we stay calm in times of distress and try our very best not to split or move, triangulate kids between adults? And I mean, often in divorce situations, this is tricky, but certainly in multiple generations of, grandparents to parents to grandbabies, can become really hard. And there's certainly not enough time to address that dynamic. There's lots of great resources out there around that, but I would say a family systems approach to understanding this is always the best. And in the meantime, being the oldest adult in that state, in that experience, means looking after you becomes the most important thing on the planet. Because if you are okay, if you are regulated, if you are aware of the ways and the patterns that dysregulate you, it'll be so much easier to stay regulated and walk through the big emotions. Okay. Another great question: are those with borderline personality disorder aware of the emotional roller coaster they put people through? It's such a hard question to answer because in the very nature of it being egosyntonic, often it isn't, because they're very focused on getting their own needs met, because the world feels like such an unsafe and scary place that I'm doing my very best to stay in relationship with another person, and I can't see the forest for the trees. So no is I think the simple answer. I'm interested to know what personality disorders can manifest in adulthood. How can a loved one navigate this type of scenario? So I hope this question was kind of answered tonight a little bit around, I'm interested to know what personality disorders can manifest in adulthood. All of them can manifest. Oftentimes, the data is really interesting where it's like, there is a sense that those patterns are laid out in adolescence, and there's lots of there's two sides to this debate, right? Don't ever diagnose a personality disorder in adolescence, because of course it's still developing. And so do not make the mistake of labeling a kid with a personality disorder, which is I'm 100% in agreement with. At the same time, when we start to understand patterns of dysfunctional relationship, when kids have experienced trauma, we start to see them approaching the world in any of the ways that we talked about tonight, those are the best times for intervention. How do we get the big people on board, teachers, the people who love them, hockey coaches, whoever their village, to understand that their needs can be met, and so that the system will regulate and right itself. So from that perspective, intervention earlier is always our best bet. But later on, it really is then that sense about how do we start to provide corrective experiences or rewrite stories that is really the heart of most therapeutic interventions. Marty, do you have any? Okay, because I got lots.
Multiple disorders in one cluster.
Okay, so here's the interesting thing about, can a person have multiple disorders in one cluster? Here's the interesting thing. Oftentimes there's a lot of overlap. As we talked about in some of those disorders, it becomes really difficult. It's almost like it's a very much a scientific process of trying to separate this one and this one and this one, because there isn't sort of a this is cancer, this isn't cancer, this is diabetes, this isn't diabetes. There's very much an overlap of some of those experiences. And my question, oftentimes when I'm trying to figure this out for a particular patient, or working through this with somebody, is really the question about much more of the pattern and why it's there versus why it's labeled in this specific way. But the simple answer is sort of yes. And typically it's because the interaction with the world has created this sense of this is how I have to show up because it doesn't make sense otherwise. And so do I feel a little bit like I have to be very protective and seemingly in control of everything, narcissistic in some ways, fuck the world, I'm fine. And then very emotionally labile and fragile underneath. Yes. Right. So then do we still have some of those aspects that sort of look a little bit like a borderline personality disorder fitting into this narcissistic or histrionic place? I think it's very difficult to sort of say this is 100% this is 100% this. So yes, and I get so much of the time why this becomes so confusing. This is one of the problems with the DSM is that you really can't put people in boxes, but we do need a system to identify what happens when people develop experiences that make it difficult for them to show up in the world. And then how do we treat or identify treatments that can address some of those symptoms that look similar? So it's that, I think, that tricky place. Sure.
Is someone struggling with codependence have a dependent personality disorder?
No. So does someone who struggle with codependency have a dependent personality disorder? No, not necessarily. And again, I'm just talking in general terms here. A dependent personality disorder is really dysfunctional in the way that they operate. Many of us develop senses or experiences of codependency on another human being, which, again, starts out in, can you rely closely on a best friend or a partner to be your person to help you navigate big things in the world? Yes, that's kind of the point, right? And, codependency is a term that Melody Beattie first coined, and there was a very popular phase in the world where codependency no more, and the book that she wrote was like all the rage. And I think the point in that is really, how do we navigate our own sense of self in relationship, which is the heart of personality disorders, but being able to sort of get lost in a relationship or codependent in navigating emotional regulation in another doesn't necessarily mean that becomes a personality disorder, because how it affects your life at work, at home, in relationships outside of that are really the best way to sort of identify if that sort of steps into much more of a clinical personality disorder, because they tend to be more all-encompassing, not just necessarily affecting one relationship. Can a person recognize a personality disorder in themselves and seek to change? Yes. I think that there's lots of really great information and resources out there that, we're the first generation really that has so much access to resources, which is a danger, because everybody's self-diagnosing. Everybody is like, holy fuck, I got this, I got that, or my mother has this, or this is my ex has this. There's so much danger in that, right? Because we all adapt to the world based on how we show up in our patterns of relationship. And I think when we get to the extreme state of a personality disorder, oftentimes having insight into how we interact with the world is helpful, period. Because so many of us need a regulating other to sort of reflect and talk about our experiences, to put them somewhere, even if it's a journal, to make sense of, that makes sense to me about how I did this, so that the pieces that got sort of split apart or disconnected in some ways then kind of fit back together again. And we sometimes do that with growth or new experiences, or we get out of stressful situations. And so I think, your ability to sort of reflect on how you show up in the world is a really healthy thing to do. And how, you can seek change is, I hope that all of us are in that place. I mean, I think about this all the time. How am I reflecting on my behavior? How, am I journaling? What am I doing when I sort of reflect on how I handled myself in that particular situation? And why do I get so triggered when, Erin is so condescending to me? Right? What the fuck is that about? And so really reflecting on these things sometimes is why, the work that people talk about often, she's done her work, he's done his work, they've done their work, is never really done, because we get through different stages and phases in our life. Our work as a college student is looking different than our work as a mom or a wife or a partner or, somebody who wants to, is questioning sexuality or their gender identity, like all of those things. Really, what is it about the world and our interaction? And this is what I love about psychology, right? Is that it is this understanding of we are a dynamic, complex organism that does not exist in isolation. And how we interact with people and how we trust those interactions really are the heart of everything we do and talk about. And it can feel exhausting and overwhelming. And it does for me quite often, but it is often fascinating to me. And the bottom line always for me is about this state of emotional regulation. What are you doing in this body to get back to the best parts of yourself? And what are those resources that we could put in place or we can direct you to or talk about so that you can maintain that sense of emotional regulation, that sense of the best access to the best parts of yourself? We'll all flip our lids. We all lose our fucking minds. I always say this about kids these days. If you watch me with my own personal children on my worst days, you'd never buy the book, right? It's a national bestseller. I've done a really that's a great goddamn book about parenting and teaching and what it takes to navigate kids through emotional dysregulation. But when I've lost my friggin' mind, you wouldn't buy it. Because so much about this is when we are regulated, when you are regulated, you are phenomenal because you are at your best. You have access to the best parts of yourself that the world has given you, that the people in it who loved you the most have given you. And most of our job in therapy or in relationship or surrounding ourselves with people who bring out the best or get us back to the best parts of ourselves is really the focus of life for me. Okay. Okay, so I hope I answered some of those. Narcissistic personality disorder, can it be treated? Yes. How can parents support someone who does not recognize they have a personality disorder? If my child is not willing to seek medical, social work, psychiatrist guidance, should I go so that I can be better to educate myself? Yes. Sometimes it is the big people in the world that, people say this to me all the time. My kid won't go see somebody because they're depressed. My partner won't see somebody because they got bipolar. This one, I did it. You know who matters the most in this situation? You. And I say this all the time. I will always take whoever I have at the table, because oftentimes it is the sense of navigating the relationships around each other that really predict how we can set boundaries and assist in creating that emotionally regulated state. The other thing that I think we underestimate a lot when we're trying to get insight, particularly in our children, our adolescents, is how do we navigate relationships that don't necessarily need to be us? Because this more than anything. I've never met a bad parent. I've met parents who so desire with the best of their skills to help their children through hard things. And oftentimes we are better with other people's children. This is the truth. But we never want to give up that sense that we failed our children. We often are embarrassed if our children are struggling in a particular way or they're making bad choices in their life, which is PS, the hallmark of all children. And so oftentimes this concept of it takes a village to help our babies navigate through things is so critically important. I mean, I say this to people all the time. I know you want to be the one, but when we can sort of shift this village idea of I'm going to look after your babies and you look after mine. Do not doubt for a second that I'm going to struggle with my 3. And when I, feel like Livy is saying things like, I hate you, I never want to talk to you again. I want to make sure she's okay. So who's going to be able to navigate that relationship with her? Who's her person? Do I call in her teacher? Do I have a conversation with the person that, is her hockey coach, with Marty, your best friends who can be like, I'm going to take her for a Slurpee or a coffee, and I'm going to just check in. Leaning on your people in this time of such social media inundation is never been more important. And unfortunately, we've never been so debilitated, it seems, to do that because we feel as though our constant state of comparison as parents means we should fucking figure this out. We don't want anybody to know that we are failing our children whatever way we think we may be, okay? But never underestimate, particularly with personality disorders, and I can say this as a therapist, oftentimes when I have somebody who is struggling significantly with a clinical personality disorder, I need a therapist to be able to consult with, because very quickly I can get caught up in a dynamic and not be able to stay regulated in the motion. set the limits, the boundaries, all those things. And Marsha Linehan talks beautifully about this, but it is sort of so critically important when we're building the village to be able to fight the emotion, not the individual. How can parents support someone who does not recognize they have a personality disorder? Yeah, okay, we just answered that. I'm sorry. We've read DPT program options and skills, but it's a struggle in terms of the resources in this world for sure, and getting private healthcare. This question is really, what we provide DBT in our program as an option for skills, but I wonder what other forms of skills coaching are effective in supporting people managing personality disorders. Great question. The only thing, not the only thing, one of the things that I researched a little bit, when I was looking at, talking tonight is really, I'm a massive fan of EMDR. And which is really a body-based therapy that really gets back behind the talking and really into the feeling of the body. Where do you feel it in your body? And there's lots of data around EMDR, more so now than ever, because there wasn't even when I was practicing, more specifically, your heart more, maybe 5 years ago. But there's some beautiful data now around really getting into the body and reprocessing, connecting to some of those emotions that really, this fundamental body beliefs that the world is a scary or a bad place. And so I think that would be my next stop. Certainly if DBT is something that, you've offered, really step into that world of EMDR. Borderline personality disorder, autism, and ADHD. We are seeing a lot of overlap in misdiagnoses. What do you think? Yeah. I see lots and lots of misdiagnoses. The question for me always is, what happened to you? I am such a huge believer of creating a genogram, an ecomap, a story on paper. I'm such a visual person when I work with people, as I just need to know exactly, okay, who was here, what was here, tell me the story, how did these all fit together, and who are your people and who wasn't your people, and where did you come from, how does this work? And I think sometimes it is looking at that conceptualization, that piece all together, that gives us such insight into how we then made sense of our world that really matters. And I think I am a much bigger proponent of assessment than I am treatment, because we often treat things based on a set of symptoms that we haven't really identified why they're there. We've just looked at the symptoms. And so I can treat your anxiety or your depression or all those things, but I want to know why, because I can give you all the breathing strategies and the journaling and the fucking yoga shit. But if I don't understand why it's there, it's often a waste of time. Further, if I don't understand the system in which it is happening within, this has probably been some of my biggest mistakes in therapy, in my work, is not including the wider system sooner or at all. And I think oftentimes we can get overwhelmed, particularly with patients with personality disorders, really getting caught into the dynamic instead of addressing, is it possible for us to, bring your partner in, to have a one-on-one session with you and your daughter? Is it, can we talk about the system and the stories that you might tell about the people who love you the most? And, I think that's sometimes some of the most effective interventions that we can do. Okay. Borderline personality disorder has been cited as the most painful and stigmatizing mental health disorder, especially with women. How do we break down these barriers? How can the ER, inpatient, outpatient do better to break down those barriers? Okay, love this question. This is so true, because oftentimes we talk about people as having the borderline. And I think that mental health is stigmatized as, any mental health disorder is something we talk about all the time, which is really the impetus for a conversation like this. Is nobody who has a personality disorder wanted it. And nobody who struggles with a mental health disorder wanted it. And, we talk about this in the world of child psychiatry often, like if kids will do better, if they can do better, they would do better. And part of our job is to figure out then, that this is one of the most debilitating, scary, concerning classes of disorders. And when people understand that that's how they show up in the world, my gosh, we have access to all of this data and reading that would suggest, this is a struggle, it's impossible to treat, it's impossible. None of those things are true. And particularly when you think about it as something that has been acquired by the way that you have made sense of the world. And our job is to really, how do we unlearn or unpack some of those things so that the world can be seen in a safer place, just one sweet step at a time. Okay. And that often happens in the context of relationship. Okay, what signs and symptoms might be present in childhood to early adulthood? Okay, so great question. There's so many things around, I think, taking a look at what happened to you that can identify, again, really keep in mind, personality disorders are quite rare when we think about the vast nature of the world, but it is certainly understandable that when people struggle with relationships and the stability of relationships in their lives, that then being able to do that successfully into adulthood might be a struggle, is one of the things that I'm often concerned about the most, right? How are we interacting with other people? How do we stay calm in times of distress? Who's there to catch you when you fall? All of those kind of questions would be the things I'm looking for when I see kids struggle. But I also want you to know more than anything, and please hear me if you don't listen to anything else that I say this, the chaos is necessary to learn to calm. If your children are struggling with emotional dysregulation, that's their job. Somebody had said to me today, I'm worried about, or the other day, I'm worried about my 7-year-old who always loses their mind over video games. Yeah. That's their job. Do not panic that your teenager is losing their mind because they're dysregulated or they're pushing back or they're making bad choices. In order to figure out, it's not if they do those things, it's how we respond that matters the most. Okay. Walking people home is what we need. You think about in your most significant time of distress, which you typically don't need is somebody to tell you what to do. Take a deep breath, plant a tree, fucking journal, do all these kind of things. In the moment, what we need is somebody to walk us back to that state of regulation. Again and again and again. And if you're too dysregulated or if this becomes too difficult or hurtful or painful for you to be the one who does that all the time to somebody, have you built a village around your child, your loved one, your partner that allows you to sort of walk through those things together? I think is the question. And that is a lovely question. I love that. So let's end there for tonight because I know our time is almost up. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for joining me tonight. I know it was an interesting topic, and I'm so grateful that we had a number of asks to be able to talk about this, and I hope you find it helpful. I really do. I'm super interested in your feedback. There's an email that will be sent out, as there always is, to sort of give that feedback, what you'd like to see more of or less of, or what you thought about tonight. I always love to hear those things. And next up is our next workshop, and I think there's availability right now, or you can grab your ticket right now so you have that, is October 3rd, Navigating Social Media with Kids and Teens. That one I am super jacked about. I'm going to talk about, I'm going to do a deep dive with a very good friend of mine who worked in the child exploitation unit, and really talk a lot about the scary world of access to social media with our adolescents in this time of distress, in this time of such neurodevelopment. What is that doing? How do we protect our kids? What do we do about it? And so I can't wait to dive into that. And so I hope you'll join us, or send this to somebody who you think might need it too, or the link that we'll send out in the next little bit. So thank you. Our time's up for tonight. Again, such an honor always. And I look forward to seeing you back here again next time. Take care of each other.